Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. You are listening and watching Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. I'm very excited to be joined today by Mark Pomar, who in the past, in the 1980s, was in charge leading Russian service of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. Two of the most important radio stations for me as I was a child, but for many people in Soviet Union who were trying to understand what information was really, what was really happening. All we knew was that the information that was coming at us from the television sets and the radio and the Soviet newspapers was not correct. There was not truth there, but what the truth was, we could only imagine. But luckily, there was Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, among others, to provide a different perspective. So I'm very excited to welcome Mark Pomar to the program. Mark, thank you for being here.
I am delighted to be here.
Well, and you're also author of a new book, Cold War Radio, which I think is very timely as Russia is about to, seems like, go back to shortwave radios in their efforts to limit amount of information coming in from outside. So let's take a look at the time that you spent kind of in a thick of things. When you were leading Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, did you understand the importance of that of those institutions of freedom of the press that you were providing? How did you feel about the work that you were doing at the time?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program. It's always a delight to speak with you and also to talk about a very important subject, such as the Cold War and its implications for today. Let me put it a little bit into context. In 2018, I, in quotes, retired, not completely, but from full-time employment, and realized that I had spent close to 50 since the early 1970s involved in one way or another with Soviet-American relations. First, as a graduate student, I traveled to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1973, and I remember it very well. I was then a Fulbright scholar in the Soviet Union, so that my retrospective on the Soviet Union was quite rich for an American born in the United States. And as I look back over my life, I realized that I had witnessed and been part of one of the most fundamentally important events, I think, in world history, which, of course, is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the breaking out of Eastern Europe as free nations. And I had been at the radios from 1982 to 1993. So those critical 11 years when we went from the depths of the Cold War to the heights of post-Soviet, post-communist life. I had witnessed and I was part of that world. And I realized that most of my colleagues from that period, I was on the very young side, by 2018, 2019 had either passed away or were so old that they no longer were involved in events and remembering those. And I felt I had an obligation and a need to take the reader inside that world and to communicate as best as I could what it was like to work at Radio Liberty, at Voice of America, what we did, who were the people, what we put on the air. So little has been written about that. So the book combines a kind of personal look with quite a bit of research. I went back and I listened to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of programs, some of which I remembered from those years. Others were a delight and a surprise to me. They are available on Radio Liberty. They're available online. Anyone can go back and listen to them and see what they were like and what we tried to do. So that was the intention behind the book. And you're absolutely right. That period was critically important. And I knew, having met many Soviet dissidents, human rights activists, writers. You have to remember that in the 1980s, the elite of Russian intellectual world lived in the West. People, of course, know Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and there was Slava Rostropovich and Galina Vishnevskaya in Washington. There was Viktor Nekrasov in Paris. There was Vladimir Vainovich in Munich. There was Vasily Aksyonov in Washington, and on and on and on. The writers, thinkers were all in the West, and they were part of the radios. They were a fundamental part of what we broadcast. They were on the air, and meeting them and talking to them and getting them on the air was one of the most exciting periods of my life.
It's interesting because of how differently Voice of America and Radio Liberty are viewed in the West versus how they were viewed in the Soviet Union. Because Soviet Union being very much a top-down society, and the propaganda and information played a crucial role. I think we may even see that now in Russian war against Ukraine, where the first priority is to destroy opportunity for people to communicate, because Russian society being top down, they see their weakness is in you break the links of connecting the pieces, and the society just falls apart, because in a totalitarian society, people are so used to being interconnected from the top down. And so, so Voice of America, which in America may seem like, is it still there? What is it? It sounds kind of familiar. Is an institution in Soviet Union and in Russia now, because it provides information which is so crucial. Means it's such an important part of the Cold War back then, or Cold War now. So from here, it may seem that you were not as important position as it seems like you were from the Soviet point of view.
Well, for various reasons, the American public did not know anything about Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, for the simple reason that it was very hard, if not impossible, to listen to it in the United States. In other words, all the broadcasts went to the region that we were broadcasting to, and it would be virtually impossible to hear it on shortwave radio. Plus, in case of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, it was all in the languages of those countries. So the Polish service only broadcast in Polish, the Russian service in Russian, the Ukrainian service in Ukrainian. So unless you knew those languages, it was virtually impossible to know what was being broadcast. In the case of the Voice of America, there was a law called the Smith-Mund Act that acted really pretty much until the 90s, which dictated that the U.S. Agency for International, USIA, United States Information Agency that oversaw Voice of America, did not have its programs in the territory of the United States. In other words, they were for foreign consumption, not for domestic consumption. And so very few people, I'll tell you a funny story. I went to Vermont to interview Solzhenitsyn for Voice of America, and I spent several days with him, and he read from 1914, and we did an interview. But in checking into the little hotel in Cavendish, Vermont, you put in your employer, and I put Voice of America, and the woman turned to me and said, is that an American singing group? Not knowing even what Voice of America was, she assumed that it was some kind of choir or chorus, the Voice of America, showing just exactly how ignorant Americans were about a very, very important institution that had hundreds of millions of listeners all across the world. But coming back to your point, which I think is a very important one, yes, our mission was not to bring down the Soviet Union. Our mission was not regime change. Our mission was very simply to allow Russians and other, obviously, citizens of the Soviet Union the opportunity to hear what the rest of the world was discussing and talking about, and events that took place. And this is a very important part of it, to allow those Russians who were exiled or silenced, or in today's vernacular, canceled, the opportunity to relate to their countrymen, to go back and be able to communicate. I'll give you a very good example. Galina Vishnevskaya, the great opera diva of the Bolshoi Opera, once she and Rostropovich were denied Soviet citizenship and basically exiled, her name and photographs were excised from all publications of the Bolshoi Opera. And she told me that she's looking at 20 years of the Bolshoi, major publication book, and every picture where she was supposed to be in had been taken out and erased from history. We invited her to come to the VOA studio, read from her memoirs, talk to her compatriots, people who knew her, fan clubs. We gave her that opportunity, as we did to Aksionov, to Vainovich, to Solzhenitsyn, to virtually every writer in the West, that opportunity to communicate with their readers, with their fans. So that was a fundamental part of the radios. We also broadcast news that you would read in the leading newspapers of Europe or the United States. We had a program that was very popular with Soviet listeners. It was called A Review of the Western Press. And what that program was essentially 2 or 3 people sitting down looking at what the New York Times, Washington Post, British Guardian, Le Figaro in France, whatever the basic newspapers were in the West, and giving a Russian listener a taste of what was being written about the Soviet Union, about the West, about issues in the world, so they would be connected to what was happening in the world.
That's great, because I'm doing something similar right now, and it is one of the more popular features on this channel. To have the review of what is this American press, what are they saying about us? Russians are very curious about it.
And that was a feature. Now, I think in the 90s and probably early 2000s, it may not have been as critically important, only because material was available in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. As you may very well recall, there were actual debates on Russian television in the 90s where people took different points of view and presented things. And there was very little, if any, censorship in any way that we understand it in Russian history. Now, of course, we're back, and this is so critical. We're back to many of the principles that we were facing in the 1980s. I would add, from my point of view, it is harder now than it was for us in the 1980s, curiously. And I say that because I think in the 1980s, communism was dying. You know, when I went on my Fulbright in 1981 to Leningrad, I never met a single person. Now, granted, I was in sort of the elite academic crowd who had anything but total and absolute disgust toward the Politburo of the Soviet Union, its policies, its war in Afghanistan. I never met a communist. I never met anybody who would even speak positively about what was happening in the Soviet Union. And as many people told me at that time, nobody would die for communism. Nobody would fight for communism. Now we're facing a different situation, and I think a more dangerous situation, where there is a aggressive imperialism, an aggressive nationalism that has really infused a significant percentage of the Russian population. Why and how that has happened is, of course, a topic to be discussed by many people over time. One could offer various explanations, but I think it's a combination of imperialism, a kind of victimization, that we are disliked, we are hated because we are true, whether we're true Orthodox or we're true Christians, or we stand for, traditional values, and people do not. We have to stand up for it. There's a sense of aggressiveness, I think, in today's, which makes it harder to penetrate. And I think the best examples are when people in Russia don't believe their own children, calling them and telling them what's happening in Ukraine. They refuse. They watch Russian television and they are zombified in terms of understanding what's happening. I don't believe that was the case in the 1980s or 1970s. Quite to the contrary, people were very eager to know and understand the West. They sometimes had exaggerated notions about the West, sometimes, quite unrealistic, but nonetheless, it was not this kind of aggressive anti-Westernism.
It's, I guess, first for clarification, I suspect that when you were there in the 80s, even though you were not surrounded by anybody who supported Soviet Union ideology, chances are that you had somebody who was watching after you from KGB, as you were a notable person. And, there's probably notes made on where you were, what you were doing, and all that kind of stuff. So you were still under supervision, but it was less obvious than it is now, because what I'm hearing from some of my guests is that the culture of writing to police and danos, turning people in, is more fervent now than it was back then, which is one of the puzzles of how can Soviet Union and its culture of totalitarian control on one hand disappear, and on the other hand come back more virulent now than ever.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in terms of course, in the Soviet period, I'm thinking of 1981. I was there for significant several months, but I was there for seeing and meeting Russians at the university, the Academy of Sciences, and various theaters. And some people did tell me discreetly that, yes, they had had a visit from someone from the KGB who asked questions, but it wasn't overtly political. I was there on an established program with a Soviet, in quotes, scholar in the United States for the same number of days that I was in the Soviet Union. And so long as we didn't, and I didn't I didn't trade money on the black market. I wasn't involved in anything illegal. There was no reason to in any way interfere with my visit, and frankly, it was a very pleasant visit. I had no problems at any point. This is a very curious one, but maybe this you will appreciate. I was going to go from Leningrad to Moscow, and I wanted to take a day train because, remember, Americans were very restricted. I had to sign a piece of paper that I would not go 20 kilometers outside of Leningrad without written permission. I mean, that was very much drilled into my head that I couldn't just buy a ticket and go to Moscow. That was just not legal, or any other cities that were closed. Most of the Soviet Union was closed to American citizens. So I wanted a day train so I could at least look at the countryside. No, they insisted it had to be a night train. I said, no, I wanted a day train. They said, no, you have to have a night train. And we went back and forth until I prevailed. And I did prevail. I said, I'm only here. I want to see. And of course, as I was taking the day train, I would see the little towns and villages, but they were so afraid that a Westerner would see something outside of the cities where you were allowed to be in legally. And I think that probably the biggest change for those of us like myself who traveled quite often to the Soviet Union was in the 1990s. All those restrictions were lifted, and I could buy a ticket anywhere I wanted. But what's curious is that by 2012, that started reappearing. And in 2012, I was living and working in Moscow. I encountered being in a city, Russian city, and being asked to the hotel, where is your permission slip to be registered at the hotel? We need to inform the local FSB. That started in 2012. Up until 2012, I never encountered that. And I was in many different cities in Russia and quite free to travel. So that period ended, that amazing period between 1991 and 2012, where really foreigners could travel around the country. And now, of course, that's long gone.
Let's talk a little bit about the so-called Russian culture. It's a big topic, particularly in Russian language, because one of the ways that Putin's propaganda promotes Russia as a world power is with its understanding how it sees soft power by speaking about Russian culture, speaking about famous Russian writers, Russian poets, musicians, composers, performers, even though it seems like most of their most notable works were created as opposition, as response to the Russian government at the time. So Russian culture on that level is basically a culture of opposition that shows suffering and struggle, and on that level is respected and admired worldwide. Mark, what role do you feel Voice of America and Radio Liberty played in in Russian culture as a part of resistance to the Soviet Union, resistance to a totalitarian regime, which kind of fits in with the Russian culture historically?
Well, you know, Russian culture in many ways is the very core of Radio Liberty, certainly, and to a great extent of Voice of America. And that is independent Russian culture, free Russian culture that doesn't have to toe the line of whatever the latest Kremlin directive may be. And, you know, one could write, I have a chapter on Russian culture in my book, and it doesn't do it justice in the sense that one could write an entire book on, let's say, Radio Liberty Russian service, strictly from the point of view of culture. The writers who had been exiled, the ones who had been silenced, the ones who were under control in one way or another. I mean, from music to literature to the arts, whatever field you take, just to give an example, Alexander Gadich, so much loved as a bard, as a poet, was a mainstay of Radio Liberty. He had over 500, until he died very tragically in the 70s, he had over 500 programs on Radio Liberty where he would take his guitar, go into the studio in Paris, and just talk to it and sing and extemporaneously talk to his listeners. 500 programs you can find on Radio Liberty archives. That is an incredible, incredible part of that culture. Or Vladimir Vysotsky, or Bulata Kudryava, songs and that they could or could not sing publicly, and they had problems, were the mainstay of so many programs on Radio Liberty and Voice of America. Baryshnikov, the great ballet dancer and choreographer, gave many interviews to Voice of America, what it was like to create ballets, what it was like to perform in the West. His name resounded in the Soviet Union after his defection, primarily because his voice was heard, because he, Brodsky, you could just name any major element of Russian culture, and they were reflected in the programming. And we sought out every opportunity to have them in the studio, to talk to them, to have them describe their life. Rostropovich gave wonderful interviews on Radio Liberty, well, especially Voice of America, since he lived in Washington, what it was like to be a musician, what he was interested in. He had followers all over the country that were eager. They may not have been politically interested in, you know, Reagan policy, but they were certainly interested in Russian culture. And I think what we tried to do was to present the diversity. I mean, Russian culture, let's face it, is a world culture. It is a world culture that is studied and debated and discussed and analyzed all over the world. And I think, as any great culture, it has many different strands, and you can cherry pick your strands as you wish, but it contains all of it. I mean, it will contain strains that people now point to and say, well, you know, Pushkin wrote poetry in 1830 condemning, you know, the Polish uprising, or Brodsky wrote something about the Ukrainians. I mean, this kind of stuff, you can cherry pick any great culture, be it British or French or German or whatever. Great. But Russian culture, as you rightly pointed out, is indeed mostly a culture of opposition. What did Solzhenitsyn say? Literature is our second government. You know, we don't have a real government. We don't have elections. We don't have participation. So we express it through literature. We express it through the arts. And I think in that sense, Russian culture will continue to develop and thrive and continue to be a world culture. The thing that I find curious about today's Russia is the extent to which they want to make Russian culture and Russian language an ethnic issue, rather than understanding that it is a world language that can be spoken, enjoyed, discussed, read by people of many different nationalities and many different ethnic groups, much like English, much like Spanish. These are world languages that aren't ethnically specific to any particular group. And I think that is something that this particular regime, the Putin regime, seems to be absolutely blind to. That you can be a Russian writer in an independent Baltic state, or a Russian writer in an independent any place in the United States and France and England. And there was a Russian culture. And that's another thing that maybe I should emphasize. Radio Liberty and Voice of America also reflected emigre literature and emigre culture and writers who grew up in emigration, but wrote in the Russian language, who felt totally at home in France, or they felt totally at home in the United States, who were very often bilingual, trilingual in many cases, but were able to write in Russian. Nabokov comes to mind immediately, but there are writers other than Nabokov who, of course, were totally at home in Europe and totally at home in Russian culture. And I think that is something that we tried to communicate, that this is indeed, if you are a great culture, you're a world culture, and you're not an ethnically specific culture.
So the upside here, I guess you can say that Russia is primed right now for great cultural development because there's so much control, and opposition to it has to express itself in some way. So that in Russian terms, these are great times.
Well, I think we will see, if this policy continues, we will see the more interesting writers or cultural figures leaving Russia, moving to the West, moving to countries where they can operate freely. And so I think if that does continue to develop, we will see a blossoming of a Russian language culture independent of the Kremlin, independent of Putin's policy. And I think in many ways that will be, and I hope, an inspiration to people in Russia to see that they are far greater as a culture than whatever Putin defines Ruski Mir as being. I mean, that's a very narrow definition. It's kind of a constricting definition of what Russian culture is.
Well, and you could say, I guess, that this is more of a like saying the artist needs to be starving in order to create great works of art. No, they don't need to be starving. And so we have, yes, you're absolutely right. There's more and more Russian writers, musicians, performers, artists that are leaving Russia and settling in what Artemy Troitsky refers to external Russia versus internal Russia. And there are some questions about the viability of external Russia in the sense that those immigrants that have left when Soviet Union was created in the first part of 20th century that have settled all over the world, but then they kind of passed on, and what was left wasn't that much. Like that culture did not survive and thrive like the culture of within the country itself. So the diaspora culture is kind of struggling because, well, any immigrant eventually starts to think about the place where they live instead of the place that they left. So do you see challenges here, and what role, I guess Voice of America and Radio Liberty can play in sustaining that great culture?
Well, I think we did a fairly good job of sustaining and helping writers survive until they could go back to a free Russia. I mean, if you look at Vasily Aksyonov or Vladimir Vainovich or, Nekrasov passed away before, but those who were able to go back really went back and were welcomed, and they had not totally torn their ties with their native country. I think, I've studied, it used to be called Россия за границей, the Russia abroad is the term that the first emigration used. And I think they had a thriving culture. I mean, if you look at, as a matter of fact, I think this is a topic for another conversation, but the whole notion of Russian studies in the West comes out of the first emigration. The first professor of Russian history at Harvard is Mikhail Karpovich, who was a graduate of Moscow University before the revolution. George Vernadsky at Yale and many others formed Nikolai Rezanovsky at Berkeley. You could sort of look at the major institutions in the United States and you could see the impact of the first emigration, and then second emigration obviously contributed to it as well. The creation of Russian studies as we know it today and the creation of Slavic departments and the growth of it really came from the emigres. They knew there were no Soviets who could come. There was a total iron curtain between the West and the East at that point. And so I think the contributions of the emigres may not be known to a lot of people, but they really are worthy of investigation. My professor at Columbia University, Mark Ryev, born in Moscow in 1922, ended up first in Germany and then in France, graduated from the Lycée in France, came to the United States, got his PhD under Karpovich at Harvard, became one of the leading Russian historians of the 18th and 19th centuries. And by the way, has a book on Russia abroad as well. And there are many examples of that, people who really established our understanding of the West, of Russia, were emigres or children of emigres.
Well, and you are such person yourself.
Well, my grandparents, so I go back, I'm too young to be, but my grandparents, yes, they left Russia at the age of about 30 when the revolution came. And so they lived in Europe, and then eventually we got to the States, but they maintained Russian, they spoke Russian, they felt very much, I heard stories from my mother when she was a little girl in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, that any day now they're going to return to Russia because the Soviet regime couldn't possibly survive another year. I mean, this is being 1929, 1930, 31. And they still maintained even ties with relatives in the Soviet Union up until 1931 or 32, when the Iron Curtain came down under Stalin, and there was no more contact. So yes, I remember that from childhood, and remember the interest. And they were, they communicated the diversity of pre-revolutionary Russia as well. It was not a uniform, many different points of view. And this is something that is also very important to emphasize about Radio Liberty and VOA, is that it had many different political points of view. And I make that point in my book that we had our monarchists, we had our socialists, we had people who came out of the Menshevik emigration who were always looking for some socialist path for Russia. They were the monarchists who dreamt of having the Tsar come back. There are many people in between who were just liberally minded. And so there was a diversity of opinion, let's say political opinion. It wasn't one point of view that was in any way imposed on the listeners.
Mark, I think you touched upon a very important point, and I wanted to go deeper into that, of explaining to people a little bit of how such an organization that is multicultural, multilingual can function in Washington, D.C. and across the world. But I want to circle back for a second to your point about all the Russian academics who started Russian studies. I am not, I am not a professional Russian. I am from Russia. So I am more likely to know, examples of Russian culture than stars of Russian studies. But it seems to me that there is a disconnect there, where Russian studies are almost kind of a spaceship that has preserved Russian culture and took off. And people on the planet that spaceship left don't really know very much about Russian studies abroad. They, because, who knows what goes on at Yale? Who knows what goes on at Columbia? Yes, students that go there, and maybe journalists know, and other academics. But for people in Russia, there's a certain moat, I feel, between the so-called traditional Russian culture and Russian studies. And it's very interesting because, there are extremely bright people that have contributed a lot to the academic development of the field that are not necessarily widely known in Russia.
Well, there was a time in the 90s when that was changing. And the reason I say that is because so many works, well, for example, I'm citing my old professor, Mark Ryev. His works were, if they were written in English, they were translated into Russian, and you could buy them in Russian bookstores. The figure that Russians did know and caused a lot of commotion was Richard Pipes at Harvard, who was a polarizing figure in Russia. Some people liked him. He was from Poland. He was born in Poland, knew Russian very well, wrote 20 books on Russian history, including probably the most thorough book, 2 volumes on the Russian Revolution of 1917. And it caused a lot of controversy. And there were Russians who were for pipes. There were Russians who were against pipes. Solzhenitsyn didn't like pipes because he thought he was too critical of and wasn't giving enough accord to the nationalist side. So there were people who became part of, let's say, the controversies and ideas and debates and so forth. More so in the 90s when it was freer, less so, I guess, now. But I would say that what's happened, and I don't follow this in great detail, but what's happened in the United States is that the key positions at the leading universities in the United States that teach Russian studies are now Russian emigres. You know, Mark Lipovetsky at Columbia is a professor of Russian literature. And before him, there was another Russian who was teaching, and it's become a place for Russian scholars to do free research, free meaning politically free, in the United States, and they can write their books as they wish. They can do whatever that interests them. And so I think Russian studies today in the United States is heavily dominated by people who left Russia in the last 20 years. Some of them received PhDs in the West. So they would leave as students to receive a PhD in the United States and become an expert on Russia. And this is true in the political field. This is true in the arts and literature side. So there is that continuation of that tradition, I would say, even more so now than it was in the past.
It just seems, I mean, I can't disagree with anything you're saying, but I also know that those names don't come up frequently in conversations, except for perhaps Richard Pipes. I agree. Maybe a couple of others, but it seems like maybe that's a spaceship that should return back to Earth and to reconnect. And then maybe this program in the future can feature some of the interviews with those outstanding scholars and academics, and maybe even, bring them back into Russian language. Because
I would say that is a very important field to do, because the kind of research that Westerners can do, you cannot do in Russia anymore. And there are excellent Russian researchers in Germany, for example, studying World War II, studying 20th century. You can write freely about any period you wish. So much material is now available on the internet that you can do quite a bit of research while you're sitting technically abroad. In those wonderful, chaotic 90s, a lot of archives were digitized back when they were available and you could get them out of the country. So there's a lot to be mined there. The archives of Ukraine and the Baltic states are quite open in terms of studying the Soviet Union. So you may not be able to get to Moscow or St. Petersburg, but you can sit in Vilnius or in Riga, or when the war ends in Kyiv, and get quite a bit of documents on Soviet behavior, Soviet actions, and so forth. So I think, and of course, remember the greatest archive library on Russian history is at Stanford, at the Hoover Institute. And of course, other great universities, Harvard, Columbia, Yale, have phenomenal archival and literature that surpasses anything you would find in Russia. So I think this is a very, very important field for a lot of work.
It is and it isn't, and I'm trying to find where one, where they connect and disconnect, because my experience with Russians is that they're not very generally curious about certain how do I say, the development of Russia, because they've been inspired for many years by Western culture. And so, studying Soviet pop music, for instance, might not be very interesting to Soviet people themselves, because they had to struggle through living with Soviet pop music. But instead, they were more influenced by the Beatles or Rolling Stones. And they're saying, why are you studying this? We were influenced by the other things. But it's an interesting dichotomy, I guess.
Well, you mentioned the Beatles. I should emphasize that Radio Liberty and Voice of America in the 60s played all of that music. and they had jazz.
And that was hugely important and valuable because there was no other way really to find it in any decent
As a matter of fact,
quality or anything. I mean, it's amazing that was, no, it's not Aksionov, no, it's not Solzhenitsyn, but in some way it was far more powerful because it achieved wider distribution, and people could accept Beatles without having to think through what Aksionov or Solzhenitsyn or even Vainovich, who is amazing, we're speaking about.
Well, we did it very purposefully. I mean, I especially, let's come back to Voice of America, which did a lot of entertainment programs. One of the things, we would sit around and strategize what to put on the air, because really we were very free to pick and choose. We did the news. Remember, we were on the air 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So we were on all the time. We had a fresh newscast. We had an evening group coming in the evening. We had a night crew. We had day crew. This was serious stuff at VOA. We had 190 people in our Russian service at Voice of America in my time. And so we had the luxury of time, the luxury of filling up airtime. And, you would obviously repeat certain programs were dictated by the news of the day, but you had a lot of flexibility in terms of looking at what other things you might want to do. And one of them, very consciously done, was entertainment. We figured Soviet life is difficult enough as it is. We should have some fun. And we hired Americans who knew Russian, who studied Russian, who may have even spent some time in the Soviet Union on a language program, but were not native speakers of Russian. So they would have an accent, they would make occasional mistakes, but they were authentic, and they knew American Western culture in a way that emigres would not. And so we put them on the air and said, go to it, ad lib, be cool, joke around, relax, don't be uptight the way so many people were, of course, on the air. And they got letters from the Soviet Union. They were in many ways the fun part of being at the Voice of America. And of course, they thought it was the greatest job in the world. They learned Russian, they were paid decently, and they got to go on the air and have fun. So it was a very conscious part. Radio Liberty was a little bit more highbrow, a little bit more serious, but they also did the Beatles. They had a jazz program. They had different musical programs. There's and I write about this in my book, but I went back to the 1950s and came across a very interesting Russian emigre who is known in the United States as Vernon Duke. And Vernon Duke was a friend of Gershwin's. He composed many songs, popular songs in the 1930s. But his real name was...
I'm trying to think of, I can't remember specifically name anyone. I should look it up. But Vernon Duke is a standard name in a jazz fake real book because he wrote so many tunes.
He is, of course, Vladimir Dukelsky. And Vladimir Dukelsky, born in St. Petersburg, graduate of the conservatory, wrote some beautiful classical music under the name of Dukelsky. And he was part of the first emigration. And Gershwin said, that's fine. You continue as Dukelsky when you're composing classical music, but for other things, you're becoming Vernon Duke. And he had his program on Radio Liberty in the 1950s, the music program that he did. And he would, talk about music happening in America, music in the Russian context, and of course, beautiful native Russian. So there were all kinds of interesting people that one can dig and find in those years. So the music was always an important part. And of course, we had jazz with a program at VOA that received so many positive responses and how it was done. So that was all part of a package. What we wanted to do is we wanted to give Soviet listeners something they could not get, obviously, from their own media. And that is a certain amount of fun, a certain amount of freedom, a certain amount of just different points of view. So we would have discussions where you could see different points of view on political issues, historical issues. Remember, the Voice of America, by law, not only presents the policy of a current administration, but has to present as they call, reasonable discussion of that policy by other people who may disagree with it. And so you're getting immediately for a listener in the Soviet Union an understanding that just because the president said something doesn't mean that everybody falls into line and agrees with it. Quite to the contrary, there are vigorous debates against that point of view, whether it's Reagan, whether it's Carter, whether it's Bush, it doesn't matter who it is. And I think that we felt was the right lesson. And in this regard, I would say one of the monumental moments, I guess, for the radios was the Watergate hearings, where Voice of America broadcast the Watergate hearings and what was being said on Capitol Hill, and the fact that Nixon was losing. And I think for older listeners in the Soviet Union came up to me and said, you know, this really changed our opinion about Voice of America. If you can talk about your president and openly and properly and factually the way you did with the Watergate, that means a lot. That means a lot in terms of credibility. It means a lot in terms of how you approach the news, that you're not shading it, that you are actually presenting what is there. And I would say, just jumping ahead to just our recent times, the Voice of America presented the two Trump impeachments exactly the way they presented the Watergate. I mean, you just translate it, you go straight with it. It's a straight story. It's a news story. It doesn't matter who and what the administration may be. You go with the news of the day.
Well, and that brings us to the political part, the policy part of Voice of America and Radio Liberty. How did you experience change in different administrations? How do you retired in 2018. We can remember who was president back then still. And how did you feel the official pressure or lack thereof on those media institutions? That's part one. And part two is all the languages that Voice of America is broadcasting in, from Soviet or from the Russian. It seems like it's almost interchangeable at times. Point of view, Russian language is such an important central part of organizing the empire. And so to have all the other languages is already a rebellion against the central authority. So you have, and then how do you keep track of all of them? Because, you got to have somebody who understands the policies of American government and speaks Polish or Azerbaijani or any number of languages. How do you square all of that away?
Well, as any large, complex organization, we always had our share of problems, occasional scandals, occasional things that went wrong. So I don't want to paint a picture that everything was just absolutely smooth sailing all the time. But I think there were things built into it. There's a difference in mission. So the Voice of America's mission fundamentally was to present the United States and policies about it and life in the United States. But we were free in different administrations to go our own way. And I think if one were to track the different administrations of Voice of America, starting with the Truman days and up through you will see that under certain administrations, there was a sense that this was important. We should let the journalists do their work. There were other administrations that, for various reasons, wanted to tighten control. So, for example, during the détente years, I'm thinking of the 1970s, the détente years, starting with Nixon and kind of ending with first 2 years of Carter, you had, if you wish, certain amount of pressure on Voice of America not to upset the Soviet relationship. So to give you an example, it's a really egregious example, that in 1974, all the other radio stations were broadcasting the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag. Excerpts from it. BBC was doing it. Radio Liberty was doing it. Deutsche Welle was doing it. New York Times and the Washington Post were publishing long excerpts from it. Voice of America was told, no, that is too provocative. That is too upsetting to our agenda with the Soviet Union. We are discussing, and that caused a lot of controversy because there were people who thought that was outrageously improper, that we should have been doing it. Others, especially in the State Department, thought, well, we have to keep it within bounds. Yes, you can report about Solzhenitsyn, you can say what's in the news, but you can't read the Gulag. Under Reagan, that changed dramatically. Under Reagan says, go to it, interview whomever you wish, put them on the air, and gave tremendous amount of freedom to do that. So different administrations approached it differently. And it would cause discussions and back and forth and controversy on Capitol Hill and so forth. Radio Liberty is different. Radio Liberty was created to be a Russian radio station, or Polish radio station as if it were in Poland, a Russian radio station as if it were in Moscow, and so forth. So there was much greater, they were at arm's length. They were not federal employees. They were over there in Munich. They were not in Washington, D.C. So there was just greater freedom to pretty much present what you thought made sense. They had its own controversies, but it was considerably freer than The Voice. I would say in the 1980s, the two were much closer. My years, maybe partly my doing, I first worked at Radio Liberty, then at VOA. So I brought certain Radio Liberty approaches to VOA, which I was able to get away with in the 80s. I probably couldn't have done that in the 70s. In terms of the different languages, yes, I was responsible for the USSR Division later on at VOA, and Ukrainian, Uzbek, Azerbaijani, Armenian, Georgian. Of course, I didn't know those languages. We had a system of what was called back translation. So we would choose, without the broadcasters knowing it, we would choose a week's worth of program or several selected days, and we would send them to someone and get a direct translation into English of everything that was said. And then that gave us a chance to sort of sit down with them and say, I'll give you a very funny example. I discovered that the Uzbek service in the Uzbek language just didn't say President Reagan, as anyone would say in Russian service. They would say the most honorable, deeply admired president of the United States. Every single time that Reagan's name came up, there was a long prefatory phrase that had to imply in the Uzbek language the proper respect that you would have toward the leader of Ukraine. We said, no, drop that. This is ridiculous. I mean, and they kept saying, well, in the Uzbek culture, that's very important. That indicates to and so on. So we would have these kind of funny controversies back and forth. But yes, I'm sure things got on the air that were maybe not sufficiently vetted, because we just didn't have enough. Russian was known by too many people. I mean, you had lots of Americans who knew Russian, and it was pretty well. You couldn't put something on the air that people wouldn't immediately know that it was not the right thing, or that it was controversial. In those other languages, yes, they were able to. But the idea behind it, and you're right, it was provocative to the Soviet authorities that we had these languages. And, in writing my book, I did quite a bit of research in terms of old documents and declassified documents. And I came across several by the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, writing to the Secretary of State saying, if you want decent relations, why are you broadcasting in these different languages? I mean, we understand Russian. We broadcast in English on Radio Moscow. But why are you broadcasting in Uzbek? Why are you broadcasting in Kazakh? Why are you broadcasting in Tatar Bashkir? And it was a point of controversy, definitely raised by the Soviet sides quite often. The answer on the American side was, well, this is a culture. It's perfectly legitimate culture. We're not advocating the breakup of the Soviet Union. We have no political agenda in our programming. We're not saying this should be separate. And I'm sure there were people in some of the language services that wanted to do that, but that was something that was certainly not official policy.
Well, Mark, in conclusion, how do you see the way forward for Voice of America and Radio Liberty now that we're back in the USSR? Well, not we, thank goodness, but Russian people basically are, minus the social protections that Soviet Union may have offered. So the situation for people there is pretty dire. At this point, there's YouTube, but that can get shut off at any moment. And people may be back to listening to Voice of America and Radio Liberty under their blankets on shortwave radios at night.
Well, the
You
problem
know,
with shortwave is that a lot of the towers that broadcast were torn down, of course, in the heady 1990s. So those towers don't even exist anymore.
so
And
first thing, rebuild the towers.
yeah,
Okay.
well, that also assumes that people in Russia have access to shortwave radios. I mean, you would have a hard time in the United States going to Best Buy and finding a shortwave radio nowadays. It's not the current technology, and certainly for the youth, that would be, I don't know, going back to just something very, very primitive. So I would say that's going to be harder. I think there are going to be new technologies that probably will be able to outwit whatever controls the Russians' empire. But that goes back to the point: are Russians interested in listening to voices from outside? We always felt that in my time, in the Soviet time, that Russians would be most interested in hearing fellow Russian voices. In other words, Americans, yes, to a point, yes, Americans on pop culture, yes, Americans on world events. But when it comes to culture and intimacy, there's nothing like a Russian voice talking to people in their own language. So I think it's going to be also upon emigres, people who know the Russian language well, to communicate that, because they're going to win a level of trust that I think just simply an American speaking in English probably would not.
You know, that makes me think back to Vladimir Voinovich's classic book, Moscow 2042, in which Russian people are just at some point throughout the day, they lay down on the ground and watch the clouds, because now Voice of America or whatever, I can't remember the exact media outlet, is streaming on clouds. So it's broadcasting on clouds. So maybe that's the future.
Maybe that's the future. Vladimir Voinovich was an amazingly interesting guy, and had a pulse, and he had an ability to make everything seem so interesting and so insightful. I was very fond of him, and I got to know him relatively well. So it was an interesting guy.
Well, I look forward to our future conversations, Mark. It's been a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much. Mark Pomar served in senior positions at VOA and RFE, Radio Liberty, from 1982 to 1993, during which time the Reagan and Bush administration made VOA and Radio Liberty an important part of their foreign policy, but also beyond. Mark, thank you so much. And you're listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin. Until we meet again, take care.
Thank you. That was wonderful.